Hey everyone, today I thought I would speak a little bit more about my understanding of the relationship of history and historiography to a meta-modern Christian perspective. There's been some confusion around exactly what it is that I'm saying and some mischaracterization of my kind of position on this issue, which admittedly is a bit kind of nuanced. So I want to kind of unpack this a little bit because it's worth getting into. Simply, I think that uh, what a lot of folks are presuming that I'm getting at is that if we kind of take for granted a certain modern naturalistic framework and then we go to read the Gospels and find miracles, we know from naturalism that miracles aren't possible. So we just presume that those didn't happen and are ahistorical. And in the process of doing so, therefore, let sort of our presuppositions from a modernist frame wind up sort of determining what we think to be true and actual about those texts. And so the concern here would just be that there's a lot of sort of metaphysical smuggling going into the issue of interpretation that is sort of just like based on prejudiced suppositions that are kind of pre-concluding the issue in advance. And rightly, if that were what I were doing, that would need to be interrogated and kind of problematized because that's sort of putting the cart before the horse. So I wanted to kind of explain more what I am actually saying, which is not that. Because it's very important to appreciate that the problematization of the miraculous, let's say, in the gospel material is actually not based on just sort of a metaphysical smuggling in of modern naturalism, that it actually arises from dealing with the historical materials themselves in just sort of a rational way. Now, to the degree that rationality and reasonableness and evidence and argumentation are modern presuppositions, then guilty as charged. But I also don't think that a lot of people watching this would necessarily want to lean too far into the notion that we should jettison those things. So yeah, let's kind of dig into this a little bit and try to tackle what it is that I'm actually trying to make the point for. And also, before I get started, I'll just kind of contextualize this a little bit more again to emphasize that in trying to articulate a meta-modern Christianity, the goal would be, of course, to integrate insights from the pre-modern, modern, postmodern, simultaneously taking the best of all of those cultural codes and sort of leaving their worst elements behind and somehow generating sort of a productive synthesis of these different cultural insights. Um, and so, as I repeatedly say, I don't see as much engagement with sort of modern history and the historical construal and interpretation of Christian materials in a lot of the current unfolding discourse around an issue of metamodern Christianity. And so I'm just trying my best to put that into the mix. And so this is part of that endeavor. And it's also then needing to be contextualized that, again, what I'll say here, I don't believe to be the most important aspect of a metamodern Christianity. I don't think metamodern Christianity should linger on, should be so emphatically concerned with the historical. I'm only doing so because I see the pre-modern very well represented, and I even see the postmodern pretty well understood and represented, at least in many aspects. And so I'm trying to be or offer a kind of corrective or balancing into that discourse at the moment and just bring more of the modern so that we can try to find some meta modern synthesis of all these things. So, okay, let's try to dive into some of this. So again, I think what people think that I'm suggesting is that I'm presupposing a particular uh, non-miraculous naturalistic framework. And given that modern frame, when I go to read the texts, I have to immediately discount the miraculous and kind of because of that, have to write off as ahistorical all of the miraculous accounts in the Gospels, the virgin birth, the resurrection, etc. And so I understand why people would say that, and so I want to unpack what I actually mean. Before I do that, though, I do want to steelman that position for a second. So this is what I'm not saying I believe this, but I think that actually even that position should be given its kind of due consideration for a minute. And I just want to kind of paint what people think I'm saying in its fullest form so people can grapple with that. So let's steelman that approach for a second. Um, so one way of steelmanning that would be to say that, okay, ancient people saw miracles kind of everywhere, right? There were always gods acting and spirits and diviners seeking omens and healers, etc. There was sort of this kind of like, right, like the enchanted garden that Weber talks about, or the porous self that Charles Taylor speaks of, that there was just a kind of natural porousness between ancient people's understanding of themselves and reality in a way that lent itself to, yeah, the projection onto reality and the seeing certain phenomena that they were kind of inclined to put there based on kind of their own lack of a fully differentiated, buffered perspective from the natural world, which doesn't show up until modernity, right? And then with modernity, you get that buffered self, you get the discovery of natural laws. Hume comes around and does a whole work on miracles and says, look, guys, if there is actually this sort of Newtonian stuff going on in the world, then what can we actually, well, let's say if there are natural, regular, repeatable, dependable laws of nature, right? What is a miracle in that case, and what sort of sense can we make of that? And he kind of, we might say, deconstructs the notion of the possibility of miracles based on the sort of nascent modernist form of thinking about natural laws. And since then, a lot of kind of intellectual and philosophical folks have sort of followed suit and found that to be fairly compelling as a framework. You get the rise of deism, in the modern period and the Enlightenment period, as the appreciation of God more as a kind of a watchmaker who kind of set the world up as like a clock and then just sort of let it go and kind of created the laws of the world. And then they run on without sort of the active intervention of an active deity. And so that was a very kind of popular way of trying to reconcile the notion of the divine God figure with a kind of naturalistic, mechanistic universe. Um, and that while despite a lot of that vision of reality being critiqued since then, also a great deal of it has seemed to remain fairly steady. I mean, physicists continue to be able to do their work. An eclipse just came by that we could predict the exact hour of, etc. There does seem to be certain kinds of mechanistic forces that operate in the world with profound predictable reliability. And there do seem to be these incredible natural laws that are inviolable, right? That they're just like, that's how they work. There are these physical constants, there are these physical forces. And now that we know kind of their mathematical relationships, there isn't really any messing with that. And actually the notion that you could disrupt those or alter them or tweak them or interrupt them is something that if you could show it to demonstrably scientifically be the case, you could actually make a lot of money. There are all these like prizes out there that have been created by skeptics and atheists and materialists and educational scientific institutions who will basically say, prove it, and great, we'll give you a lot of money. There's like the James Randi Educational Foundation has this $1 million prize for demonstrating the paranormal. Australian Skeptics has $100,000 prize. There's like there are many of these, and the fact remains the case that all of these are still unclaimed. Meaning that no one has yet been able to sort of, in an Excalibur sense, like show up and say, I will do it. I will show you the miraculous and claim the prize. So all of that money is still sort of sitting, for those who can actually demonstrate in a scientifically verifiable way that you could break these natural laws. And that should be a little disconcerting to folks who are open to the prospect of, the paranormal and the miraculous and the supernatural, etc. Now, that would be a way of steelmanning the argument, right? Because then that would lead to the sense of, yeah, it's probably fair to justify a reading of ancient texts through that lens by saying, well, these were, a number of ancient folks who didn't have a modern sense of the modern scientific, framing of reality. And so they presumed miracles were possible, and there were stories and legends, and they filled them in, and dot, 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 dot. And that's all we're basically reading in these texts. So that's not what I'm saying. But that would be the Steelman, representation of that particular perspective. Whether or not that's a justifiable perspective is, open to critique. But whatever it is, it's not the particular way into this issue that I'm I'm getting at, because that's based in metaphysics. It's saying, okay, now we know how the world works, and now we know how it's always worked. And so if there's a text that says otherwise, it's wrong. And so, based on our metaphysical presuppositions, we have to conclude that that's ahistorical or non-historical. But that's a metaphysical presupposition. That's not where I'm coming at this issue from. I'm coming at it from the realm of history, which, to be fair, brings with it certain methodological and metaphysical sorts of presuppositions, or at least procedural framing devices and means of sort of consensus sense making, that sort of a thing. So I'm not trying to suggest that okay, history or historiography is like hermeneutically pure and cleansed of any kind of perspectival situatedness. Obviously, the postmoderns have shown us that that's not the case. History is a modern phenomenon, and there are certain ideas that kind of get baked into that. But what I'm suggesting is that the only things that I'm trying to bake into the equation here are, again, evidence, um, you know, what we would think of as sort of credibility, reliability, issues of authority, um, rationality, non-contradiction, more basic kind of metaphysical presuppositions or cognitive presuppositions, I guess you could say, based on sort of rational consensus making, which I don't think that even the most ardent, even Christian apologists could possibly reject to, because they use the same sort of framework in order to make their case. They try to say, look how rational this account is for the miraculous case of Jesus. Look how good the evidence is for the miracles, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in that sense we're working in the same plane here, and I'm not trying to smuggle in a metaphysical presupposition. But the point is, where I'm coming at this is through the realm in the lens of history. And so, what do I mean by that? Well, I studied the history, when I got into this in a big way during my biblical studies career, and spent a lot of time with trying to familiarize myself with that point of the historical record. And by that, I mean this moment in first century Palestine, as best we're able to reconstruct it using historical sources. Um, and the understanding of a cultural historical milieu that existed based on all the kind of extant data that we have to work with, archaeological, you know, um, manuscript based, etc. And so when you do that and you try to take in all the materials that you possibly can to give yourself the greatest sense of what was going on in the world at this time, who do we have to draw on to make sense of this period in history? Who are the particular sources, primary, secondary, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff, right? We would hopefully try to fold all that into our understanding of trying to just get a fuller sense of this moment in the chronological record. And when you do that, here's what comes from that is a an appreciation for the messianic expectation that was underway in first century Palestine. And this won't be anything too much new for even the common churchgoer, because they'll hear a lot about this even from the pulpit, right? That like the Jews at this time were expecting a Messiah figure. He was going to be the son of David. There'd been this sort of like advanced mythos that had already been sort of generated by this period that goes back to the Babylonian exile, when the Davidic kingship in Judah is basically dismantled and destroyed because of the invasion of the Babylonians in 586 BC. And then the destruction of the Babylonian Empire by the Persians, and the allowance of the Jews to return home to their ancestral homeland in Palestine, and then the rebuilding of the temple and the frustrations that ensued, and the increasing then messianic expectations in a kind of apocalyptic cosmic sense that that the Davidic monarchy would return in all of its glory and would be led by the son of David, who would restore the former glory of the ancient Israelite nation, essentially. And by the time you're in the first century, in Roman occupied Palestine, and you've gone through periods of kind of, intense Hellenization and tensions with sort of Greco-Roman overlords, and the rise of religious zealots and the kind of, insurrectionists, or insurgency, we might call it now, of the Jewish extremists who had taken on an apocalyptic perspective and were keen to kind of overthrow their Roman occupiers and kind of usher in, the kingdom of God and all this stuff. That's the moment in which the gospel material shows up and is written, and the story about Jesus unfolds. And we have, for example, like in the work of Josephus, who's a first century um, Jewish historian who talks a lot about some of the other kind of zealots and kind of false messiahs who rose up during this time. And even after Jesus, of course, there's the Bar Kokhba revolt. I think what was that one? It was in the second century, which was sort of, again, kind of the time when all this became militarized and the uprising in a big way against Rome. There was, of course, the Jewish war that lasted from what, like 66, no, 66 to 70, or was it like 70 to whatever? I'll put the dates in, down below. But basically, first century, where you get the Romans coming in and destroying the temple because of, basically messianic expectations exploding and violence exploding. And then ultimately, the whole thing kind of crashing down and leading to the diaspora that really created sort of the rise of rabbinic Judaism and the religion of the book and all this stuff. Right. So that's kind of the historical context that the origins of Christianity is set off against. And so we have to appreciate the messianic expectation and all that religious fervor and zealousness and sort of rise of, or the recrudescence of sort of mythological cosmic thinking about the end of times and the coming of the Son of Man, the book of Daniel, all this stuff. Now, I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there, but again, hopefully my biblical studies folks will be following me on all this. And maybe hopefully even the people who just, are just devotional readers of the Bible will have some sense of, that general context. Because again, a lot of this, I think, is gestured at in even Sunday sermons and this sort of a thing of people were expecting a particular kind of Messiah, and then Jesus shows up. Okay. So given all that, there is this messianic expectation, and there are these prophecies that people have been expecting this Messiah to fulfill. So some hundreds of years go by, and people are awaiting this, and a kind of lore has built up in the expectation that this sort of cosmic messenger from the divine will come, assume the mantle of the Davidic monarch, and kind of reclaim the role of King of the Jews. And this then is the framework for understanding the figure of the Messiah, which is what early Christians come to believe Jesus of Nazareth to have been. So, given all that, we can now start to appreciate how that history informs how we would read the gospel materials. Nothing has been said so far about the metaphysics of any of this, whether this is right or wrong or whatever miracles, none of that. That's just the context, that's a historical context for the situation. So now let's look a little bit at some of the material that describes some of the miraculous phenomena that are said to have characterized the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, we can start, of course, with his miraculous birth, which is recounted in the books of Matthew and Luke, not Mark, interestingly, right? So, okay, we're only dealing with two of the Gospels out of the four. Now, this is interesting. Both Mark and Luke put the birth of Jesus in the city of Bethlehem. Now, which is interesting because Bethlehem is not, Nazareth, and Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth. So, why is Jesus born in Bethlehem? Um, how did that happen? So Matthew and Luke give two accounts for how this happened, and they both differ, and they're actually both irreconcilable. They don't overlap really in any meaningful way, meaning they both couldn't have happened, right? So in Luke, there's this decree from Augustus who has this kind of global census that he wants to do of basically doing a census of the entire Roman Empire. And in order to do the census, everyone needs to go back to their original town of their birth. And so therefore Mary and Joseph, get on a camel and go back to Bethlehem from Nazareth. That's Luke's account. Um, in Matthew's account, there's a very different story. King Herod, is sort of this, maniacal evil king who hears about the, this prophesied birth of Jesus and wants that to not happen, and so he does this massacre of the innocent, youths, the firstborn, sort of, and tries to kill Jesus. Now, here's where we can start to understand how all of this bears on the issue of miracles and history and all that. Okay. Neither one of those stories, the global census of Augustus or the massacre of, the firstborn under Herod, have any historical evidence for them whatsoever. Um, those are pretty big things that if they'd occurred, there'd be some kind of documentary basis that we could also refer to from, secular historians who weren't the gospel writers that we could refer to and say, hey, does this check out? What did they say about this event? And we don't find any of that. There's actually more than that, just very good reason to think that if you just actually think about these events, they would have never happened. Okay. Like the census of the entire Roman Empire that requires every single person to go back to the city from which they were born. That's just a bureaucratic nightmare. It's impossible to have ever been realized, and no administrator would ever think that that was a feasible course of action to do, right? So that just doesn't make any sense. If it ever did occur, it would be such an incredible, dislocation of thousands and thousands of people that you'd be sure there'd be some other record of it, and there just isn't. The only mention of this ever occurring is in the Gospel of Luke. Similar with kind of Herod's massacre of the innocents, right? If just like, Herod decides, hey, I'm gonna just kill all of these children, in my principality, that might have ended up in Josephus, right? That might have like left a record somewhere. Maybe even it would have been such a big deal that like Tacitus or some other Roman historian would have written about it. There would have been some kind of place where this would have shown up. But there isn't, right? So the only place we hear about that is in the book of Matthew. So what's going on here? We've got these stories that don't overlap, can't be reconciled. They both didn't happen, meaning, or they both couldn't have happened, and we have no evidence for them outside of, these contexts. So why? Why are they told? Well, there are prophecies around the Messiah, and the Messiah was supposed to be the son of David and descended from David to be the Messiah in order for him to be the Davidic king and thus the Messianic, cosmic king. And that meant that that figure had to come from Bethlehem, which is where David came from. And there had already been this tradition established, in hundreds of years leading up to these kinds of messianic expectations that this figure would come from Bethlehem. And there's a line that, they would draw from that went back to, the Hebrew Bible that talks about the ruler coming out of Bethlehem, which was the original mention to the ruler David, but actually now is expected to be about the Messiah. And so there was this given that the figure of the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. That was how the story is supposed to go. Okay. Now we can start to see the issue here is that if early Christians believed Jesus of Nazareth to be the Messiah, then there would be a story that needed to be told about how he was born in Bethlehem, right? And so there would need to be accounts of that would be given. And so we find those accounts in Matthew and Luke, but they're different accounts. They don't overlap, and they're based in historically dubious premises. So what do we make from that? The conclusion that historians have drawn, which seems to be the most logical conclusion, is that people told these stories to try to fill in that part of the account of the messianic identity of Jesus. And there were different traditions for then how and why a Jesus of Nazareth ends up being born in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy. Okay. And if that is what happened, it would best explain the kinds of material textual evidence that we have. I'll just put it that way, right? Because it would actually be much more difficult to make sense of the differences amongst this material and how they don't overlap and how there isn't, corroborating evidence of any kind for any of these, stories that are told. It would be much harder to explain all that based on just the historical evidence. And so the kind of Occam's razor you could say, that the historians use. Is just like, oh, okay, these were mutual traditions that somehow arose in the time after Jesus that tried to account for how he was born in Bethlehem. And when you also factor in a point I'll return to later, that these stories arise, decades after the death of Jesus, right? We're talking like the first gospel being written 40 years after his death, and the Gospel of John, 60 years after, though John doesn't have any of the birth narratives. Um, you're talking about a long period of time for oral history and oral storytelling and oral tradition to have started to try to fill in some of these details in a way that can make sense of that particular messianic expectation. So in all of this kind of Christmas miracle, right, of the story of Jesus's miraculous birth and all of that that goes into that is problematized, but it's not problematized by metaphysics. It's not saying, oh, well, Jesus couldn't have fulfilled prophecy, so therefore this all has to be made up. It's just problematized by history. It's just problematized by what we know from the historical record. And when you actually just start looking close enough at the text to try to compare them, make them sync up with each other, etc., you say, ooh, there's a big issue here. And then when you fit that into its historical context of messianic expectation and this notion of prophecy, fulfillment, and all this, then the most logical conclusion is that, oh, people made up these stories to try to match the messianic expectation and prophecy stuff, and they did it different ways. And, these are now what we get in these different gospels. Um, and so this gives us a different sense of the whole issue, I think, of the gospel material that needs to be grappled with, which is that prophecy fulfillment and sort of the historical context in which these texts arise is being the means by which material is being generated to tell the story. Um, right? So this isn't people just doing what we tend to think of history as like, oh, well, let's try to talk to all the people, eyewitnesses, gather as much sort of, empirical data as we can, et cetera, and then put all this into a narrative fashion, the way modern historians do, because this is a pre-modern context where modern history doesn't even exist yet. And there's a theological impetus for all this. Um, it's a different accounting of events and their significance based in trying to sync up people's theological vision for the significance of Jesus of Nazareth ministry, trying to sync that up with their apocalyptic, eschatological, messianic expectations and the prophecies that people believed about what this would entail. Now, when you appreciate that this is a dynamic, right, going on in these texts, you have to then see how this colors everything about what we get from the gospel material, because the birth narratives are just literally the beginning of this. This is not limited to the birth material stuff, the Christmas story. This runs throughout the entirety of the Gospels. Is that uh, is is that these stories that are being told are being recounted in relationship to oral traditions and tales that have been told in the decades after the actual historical ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, in believing communities trying to make sense of the significance of all that without radio, television, books, any of that, just oral storytelling, and trying to relate this in a meaningful way to the apocalyptic messianic expectations of their religious world. And that is the historical context in which these texts were written and come down to us. And if we don't take that seriously, then we're not taking into account all the information, let's say. All right. Now, again, just to emphasize, none of this has anything to do with metaphysical presuppositions about the possibility of breaking natural laws or anything. It's just about uh, making sense of the historical data as best we can, given what we have in terms of trying to make sense of it. So once you have that framework, you can start to see this playing out in many other instances and in many other cases where the miraculous is recounted in the Gospels, right? So let's take the example of Jesus's calming of the storm, right? This is a miracle, and I'm not at all suggesting this didn't happen because human beings can't calm storms. That's against my modernist naturalistic framework. Can't have that. No, it's just a matter of, okay, we have this story of Jesus and he calms a storm, and what do we make of that? Well, let's fill in that history and that context again to try to understand what might be going on here, right? So in ancient Christian and Jewish, I should say, apocalyptic thought, there was a resurgence of the imagery of the cosmic combat myth that related basically God's fight with this uh, figure of sea, of the draconic, chaotic waters. Jordan Peterson writes a lot about this in his book Maps of Meaning, specifically as it relates more to the Babylonian and other traditions that dealt with this myth. I recently posted a video, began a series on this, did 2 videos so far, and I'll link that and you can check that out. There was an old story of the storm god who fought the sea dragon, and that was the sort of cosmic victory over the forces of chaos and evil, which then becomes inflected in a apocalyptic way after the Babylonian captivity, and you get the rise of apocalypticism, which is the context for early Christianity. And early Christians made use of this myth to articulate basically Christ's triumph over Satan, in the eschatological end. The dragon that falls from heaven in the book of Revelation is that sea monster. And there's much you can go check out that video series if this is a compelling idea. It's a very fascinating thing. But the point is, this ancient myth winds up getting retold in apocalyptic settings to relate to the issue of God's triumph over the forces of evil, i.e., Satan, and in the Gospels, Jesus is the divine warrior figure representing God, Jehovah, Yahweh, that figure who is triumphing over Satan and his forces of chaos and defeating death. And so, with all that as background, and all that I just said, you'll find in standard biblical commentaries, even conservative ones. I mean, it's like, oh, yeah, by the way, when Jesus calms the storm, this is a callback to all those passages in the Old Testament where, God rebukes the chaos waters and he rebukes the sea and all this stuff. Well, don't we have a story in the Gospels where Jesus rebukes the sea as part of an apocalyptic motif, signaling him as the triumphal divine warrior who's here to defeat Satan? Once you have all that, you've got a context for understanding and interpreting the significance of this story. And the significance of all that is that story is telling us who Jesus is and his significance and what he's about and what he's up to, what he's doing, right? Jesus is the eschatological divine warrior come to destroy Satan and evil for all time. So with that, just as with these messianic prophecies and expectations, there is a kind of framework for storytelling to relate an account of Jesus in those terms in a way that will land in a theologically significant manner for the audience. And viewed in that lens, we would have to read that story not as a historic account of, oh, and then this happened and Jesus did this and he yelled at the sky and then the storm stopped. That's not what that story is doing at all. It's trying to relate a theological idea, drawing on all this mythological and apocalyptic imagery to communicate something profound about the ministry and the impact of the Jesus story and the gospel. Okay. Once you appreciate all that, then this story about a miracle of calming the storm isn't that anymore. It's this whole other thing. And you understand that that story might even be true, might be real, but it's not real as a thing that's trying to relate something that happened in historical time. It's not meant to be that at all. So it's something radically different, theologically motivated, and fulfills a very different purpose than just trying to say what happened, right? So again, you're getting a sense that a lot of the stories in the Gospels are coming about by people having expectations and a sort of framework for understanding already who this Jesus figure is through messianic expectation and apocalypticism. And they're basically kind of filling in the details. I mean, I don't want to reduce it either. These are beautiful stories. These are very compelling. I mean, Jesus calming the storm story, that was one of my favorite when I was younger. It spoke to me at a kind of psychological level of like, you know what, no matter what, God's in control. And that's a beautiful story. And there's a lot of like traditional devotional value that can come from that story. And that is kind of where it lands, where it hits home. But from a modern perspective, trying to understand the historical genesis of that story, there's no need in any way to suggest that this happened in historical time. That's not the point, and it's not where it comes from. And when you understand where it comes from, then you can understand what the interpretive community already would have been baking into a reading of that text. Whether or not they did or didn't understand it also is happening historically and in literal time. That's a issue we can come back to or explore in some other time. But the ultimate point is none of this is based on a presupposition of modernist naturalism to say, oh, people can't calm storms, therefore that must not be real. That must not have happened. Quite the contrary. It's just saying, oh, when we have all this other evidence and material and information to work with to understand the context from which the story springs and the community that was reading it and their expectations and their interpretive lens and all of that, then we have to shift our interpretive lens for understanding what this is actually trying to communicate. So this could be applied, throughout and in many other cases. I'll just use a couple more to kind of drive the point home. Let's talk about the crucifixion, right? So in the crucifixion, Jesus has the famous last words. Now, from a historical standpoint, you could ask the question, what were the last words of Jesus? Like that's presumably this happened in real time. And if there is one thing that like, all the historical Jesus scholars will agree on is, yeah, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the Roman authorities. Like that's confident. So given that, there were presumably last words spoken by the historical Jesus. And what were they? Well, when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all kind of have different words, right? If you read Mark, it's Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, right? Which is like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is a pretty dark, but also like kind of punk, kind of badass. That's an interesting thing there. But understandably, people were like, "Oh, that's not the best last words to put in Jesus' mouth." Let's make it something more like "tetelestai." It is finished, or Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, which really puts Jesus a lot more in control of that situation. Like, yep, okay, we're all done. I did what I came here to do, and now I'm going. And we get a different vision, all that. Now, what's interesting about the last words of Jesus is that historically, what people have done is just what they do with the Gospels in general, which is just cram them all together and say they all happened. So Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, tetelestai, and, into your hands, like, he said all of that. Even though they all like what? Um, and I just kind of point to this as an example where it's not about what he actually said, right? Um, because clearly the sources differ on that point. The words that they put into the mouth of Jesus have a theological significance based on the writing of the author to communicate not something about history, not something about quote unquote what happened in spatial, temporal time, but to communicate something about the theological significance of Jesus. And all of those different gospel writers clearly have slightly different interpretations of that, and they want to stress or emphasize different things. And so they make him say different things. And maybe I can come back to this in a minute, but like that's also not that's not a disturbing point. Like even one of the greatest historians from the ancient world, Thucydides, he just made up all the speeches he put in the mouths of the people he's describing. He's talking about the Peloponnesian War, and this person gets up, Alcibiades gets up to talk about. He just writes a whole speech for them. No one wrote that stuff down. There's no evidence he's going back to. There's no primary documentation that he's going, like Gandalf to Gondor and going into the archives and, no, he's just writing more or less what Alcibiades would have said, but in a very, in a significant way with art and aesthetics and all that thrown into boot. And like, that's what ancient historiography at its best was doing, right? So, again, we have to be careful about our expectations for ancient notions of historians and what they're saying and what happened. I'll just finish this real quick, right? The resurrection, which of course is the biggest miracle and theologically probably the most important. Um, but it's interesting because when you actually try to look at the resurrection through the lens of history, obviously this is a very difficult thing. And even if you don't try to answer like did it or did it not happen, that's not even, again, we're not getting in the metaphysics of it. We're just looking at what do the sources say, right? Well, it's kind of interesting because like the Gospel of Mark doesn't even have the resurrection basically. It's like it ends kind of in the middle of things, and we don't know what happened to that original manuscript. Maybe it got broken off later on. Someone tried to add on what they thought should be there, but we know that that wasn't really original. But the resurrection stories you get in Matthew and Luke are like very different. Matthew, Luke, and John tell very different stories about how Jesus showed up and who did he show up to first, right? These are interesting questions. What are the last words of Jesus, and who did Jesus show up to first? Was it one Mary? Was it three? Was it the disciples on the road to Emmaus? Was it, like some people will say actually, and have in other contexts, there's something weird going on here. And like that, and Pajot, I think, talks about the weirdness of the resurrection. He wants to kind of make this a case for like, there's such a profound mystery here that, we'll never understand it because even the gospel writers are weird about the way they're telling it. And that's an that's a interesting take, but a much more kind of immediate way of understanding that is just that this is a not historical thing that there's different accounts for and people told different versions of because there was some kind of sense that Jesus was resurrected, but what that looked like and what the details were, they didn't matter so much. It was more like there were different accounts of that, and so they were kind of woven together and told in different ways. And if you again try to make it all pan out and sync it up and make it coherent, it doesn't really work in the same way that the birth narratives don't work. Um, but that's just the case. Finally, there's the ascension into heaven, which is the last kind of historical point I'll make, right? Which is like, this is in a couple of gospels where Jesus was like, all right, I'm done now. Goodbye. And he goes to ascend into the heavens and sit at the right hand of God. And, we might, from our now modern perspective, say, hey, if you just go up into the sky, you're not really going to go to heaven. You're going to go into space. So, like, what do we make of that? And what we do make of that is up for interpretation, I suppose, right? But it's also, I think, best understood through the lens of, oh, the ancient world didn't have the conception of space. They did not know that if you went up, you just found space and stars and, galaxies. That wasn't on their radar. And so you get a story that is just doesn't comport in any meaningful way with what we would think of as that event, but it fits very well the ancient perspective of these folks. And it fits very well with the theological idea of these folks that, all right, Jesus is back alive now, and now he's got to go, he's not going to be around anymore. He's going to go somewhere. He's going to go back to where God is. So he'll just go up, he'll ascend into heaven. And the point is, it's a theological need to tell a story. It's not about, oh, and then everyone, oh, yeah, then we all remember when Jesus went up, and now we're going to tell that story. So it happened in historical time, right? So hopefully what some of this is just kind of unpacked a little bit is that all of this comes out of the need to grapple with the historical material and the historical context from which these texts derive, and to do what we would do with any historical material to make sense of it. Even if you radically relativize your metaphysics and say, yeah, miracles are possible or not, I don't know, it doesn't matter, right? Even if you say all that, or even if you're pro miracles, all these problems still exist, right? It's not like if you say miracles are possible and happen, and then you read the text and you get familiar with all the historical information that like this just makes all that stuff go away. It doesn't, because you're confronted with all of these contradictions and you're confronted with the tradition that needed to be fulfilled in these ways that these things don't match up together. And so from a historical perspective, you'd have to say, even if miracles are possible, this isn't history. This is something else. And it is something else because history wasn't invented really at this point at all. So, um, hopefully that clarifies a little bit where I'm coming from. Some other takeaways from this that I think are worth mentioning in regard to this issue. Whatever we make of the issue of miracles, Jesus was unquestionably, I think, and most historical Jesus scholars seem to agree with this, considered a healer and a demon exorcist and a doer of miracles, right? Like in the ancient world, if you were to like what did Jesus do? He did that stuff. And in fact, if you read the earliest gospel, Mark, I mean, that's mostly what it is Jesus driving out demons and healing people's sicknesses. Um, and it's only decades after that where you get the Gospel of John, which is much more theological and philosophical. But another thing really worth crucially appreciating here is that all of these texts were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus, right? In an ancient world where, again, no one was writing stuff down, the entire demographics to which Jesus was speaking were illiterate. Even in the ancient world, in the best of cases, only like 1 to 10% of people would have had any knowledge of writing. So it put you in a very elite class if you could even read anything, let alone write it. Um, and so we're talking about texts being written decades after the fact with no written sources to draw from at a time when many of the eyewitnesses aren't around, can't be accessed, are dead. I mean, these texts are written in Greek, so they're not being written in Palestine. They're written, probably Mark was written in Alexandria, it's thought. And by, at this point already in moving into the Hellenistic slash, into the Greco-Roman world where a lot of this stuff had already gone through modes of transformation and reimagination. But also, like, what witnesses would you possibly even hypothetically draw from for these sorts of things, right? Like, even if you were a modern historian transported back to this moment in time and you're like, I'm going to get the facts, right? Who do you find to give you the information that you're looking for? You know, like for example, Jesus multiple times in the Gospels predicts his death, and then it repeatedly says, and the disciples just didn't understand what he was talking about, right? Now, even if that happened later on, the disciples might have been like, oh, yeah, and he said that was going to happen. But it's not like they would have written down what he said in anticipation of the thing that they didn't know was going to happen happened, and then they would be like, oh yeah, and then he said this, and we have exactly the text that he said, right? So we know, just when you just do the mental exercise of thinking about where these things come from, that like what exactly, quote unquote, he said to predict his death would have had to be retroactively remembered, even if it happened, right? Because did he actually anticipate his own death? Now that's a moment where you could try to bring in some metaphysical suppositions, but we just don't have to go there, right? We just don't, that's not even the level at which we have to engage these things. We just recognize that the gospel writers did what Thucydides did, which is put words in the mouths of people. So even if there were witnesses to whatever events we think, in a traditional theological sense would have happened, um, what would they even have remembered? What could be recounted in any meaningful way, right? These are the historical questions that once you just think about them rationally, um, make you realize how separated we are from these events based in the text. And then, of course, there's the classic telephone issue, right? I mean, we all know that with time, things change and stories evolve, and the whole way that oral storytelling, shifts through time. It's actually, they've done really fascinating anthropological studies into this. Though this is mostly from like tribal societies that are oral indigenous, where they'll record an oral storyteller telling a tale, and they'll always begin, this is the way that the story is told, and they'll tell the tale, and then they record them telling it multiple times, and the anthropologist will notice that the story changes, and when they present this to the storyteller, they say, no, 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 it doesn't change. No, the story is always the same, and it's always the same story. And then they're like, well, no, I can play it back to you and you can hear. And they won't, they're like, nope, that wasn't what I said. And there's basically just this mental block of like, nope, there is this story and this is the way it is, even though there's like empirical evidence that whatever, right? So anthropologically, we get an insight into pre-modern perspectives on storytelling and history, we could say, used in the most loose of ways. I also recall one of the things that struck me very intensely in a religious studies class I took in college was a documentary. and kind of by these anthropologists in a Buddhist community. And again, note, anthropology using recording mechanisms and videotape, right? These are modern phenomena that allow us to track with sort of precision through time. Phenomena that couldn't be so tracked in the ancient world. But there was this documentary where this Buddhist sage dies, and there's this woman grieving him, and there's a sort of ceremonial rite that happens for the great Buddhist sage in this particular community where, his body gets burned and all this stuff. And so it's just kind of documenting this. And it's very fascinating because there's this wailing woman who's there. And then she goes into this rapture and she says, I've seen the ghost of the sage, and he's risen above his body, and he looked at me and he said, all shall be well with you, blah 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 blah, and follow the ways of the Dharma, dot dot dot. And then people are like, wow, this is amazing. Okay, well, we got to go tell the city leader, the village leader. So then they go up to the village leader, and the woman repeats her story and gives a very different story. And she's like, and I saw the mist rising from the sage's body, and he looked at me and he said, you shall be blessed and your village shall be blessed. And then he went into the mountain. It was just like a totally different story, right? And then it's like, and you could watch in real time how oral storytelling could shift through different contextual frames into a manner that would eventually become lore and legend in a particular community. And I just found that both incredibly fascinating anthropologically, but also devastating to my sense of my faith at the time, because I was still very held to a very kind of literal interpretation of the Bible at that time. And it was sort of like, ooh, that can happen, huh? So, the takeaway there is that, like, we know from these kinds of tools of anthropology and evidentiary tracking of this kind of information, how things can shift and stories can change and how traditions can get started. And that's empirical, that's evidentiary, that's something that we can't just like ignore, whatever else we want to make of all of this stuff. Another thing I'll mention is form criticism, right? When you read these tales of healing and exorcism and whatnot, they follow a predictable pattern, a sort of outline. And then you can eventually realize that, oh, okay, well, this is kind of a template, isn't it? Like, figure comes to Jesus, says, I need your help, please heal this person. Jesus goes, he heals them, they get up, it's a miracle, everyone marvels and wonders, and dot, 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 dot. And this is interesting because once you see that there's a kind of template pattern going on here, it can begin to, again, give you a sense for how people filled in the details of this story of Jesus, the healer, and the exorcist with memorable accounts, right? Like, again, historically speaking, we can be very confident that Jesus was an exorcist and a healer. That seems to be pretty given. But in terms of like what he did and who he healed and all that, you know, probably the vast majority of that is lost to history, except for maybe whatever tidbits might still persist in these healing stories that now have been retained in the Gospels that were written, based on oral traditions decades after the fact, etc. Right? So when you realize that there's sort of a template for these things, it's like, oh, okay, well, to explain how Jesus healed, then like we got to kind of form here that we can fill in the blanks, and then this is more or less how that works. At the very least, calls into question the historicity of every specific healing instance or exorcism story in the Gospels, right? It makes you think differently about what they mean and what they're meant to convey. And yeah, okay, so there's more I could mention. There's comparable texts from the ancient world that are part of the historical context that need to be considered. The stories about Apollonius of Tyana are often cited. Most Christians don't even know what that is, or they've never read it, they've never heard of it. But he was a healer and a sage in the ancient world who was written about in a kind of hagiographic sense, and in a way that matches very similar aspects to what we read about Jesus in the Gospels. Last thing I'll say maybe about some of the specifics. Well, no, well, you can just leave all that. All right, there's more to be said, but I think you get the point. The point is that when you take all this information together from a historical study, you just see that the composition of the gospel texts is not a simple matter of what did Jesus do and when did he do it, and writing that down, right? It's a matter of people decades after the fact who are not eyewitnesses to any of this and probably didn't have any access to any eyewitnesses, drawing on oral traditions and theological and messianic prophecies and expectations and some probably reliable historical information and various written sources, maybe of sayings or signs and wonders, whatever, to create a coherent account as best they could in those contexts to communicate a theological vision of the importance of this figure in a way that existed long before what we would think of as modern history. So, when, for example, people like C.S. Lewis want to do an apologetics move and say, all right, well, Jesus could have only been three things: a liar, lunatic, or Lord. And those are your only options, right? He was either lying about who he was, or he was just crazy, or he's the Lord of the world and your soul. That's logically the only options, right? And I just feel like that whole approach misses the entirety of like all of the nuance and complications of the historical critical perspective, you know. I mean, because what it misses is that there's something much more profoundly difficult to grapple with here, which is how far we are separated from that person in history, how much removed there is through tradition, storytelling, fabrication, memory, time, that it's not a matter of was he lying about what he said, because we don't really know what he said. I mean, there's a whole thing called the Jesus Seminar, right? And people like Funk and others who are like, who did this whole thing about how can we say most likely what the historical Jesus would have said. And there are these criteria for basing, all this stuff. And I was like, but like the point being from all of that is that we have very low confidence in any particular thing that Jesus might have said, though there is a range, right? We can be pretty confident he didn't say many things, and we can be fairly confident he probably said something like certain things. And I haven't even mentioned the language distinction here. I mean, Jesus was talking in Aramaic, and the texts we have are written in Greek, but leave that aside. Point is, there's like we don't know what he said. We don't know what he claimed about himself. Is he a liar? A liar from what account? In Mark, he has this messianic secret. He doesn't really want to let anyone know that he's the Messiah, if he even thinks he's the Messiah. And he only gives us a little maybe tantalizing glimpse that he thinks he is. And then in John, all he's saying is, I am the Messiah. I'm the Son of Man. I am the truth. I am the Logos. Like, which Lord are we even talking about here? So liar, like that doesn't even enter into, we can't even, we're so far removed from that question. We don't even know. Was he a lunatic? No, I think that's fair to say he wasn't crazy. I mean, probably from our perspective as modern people, he did believe in the imminent end of the world and that demons inhabited people and made them sick. And he, thought he was part of an eschatological divine plan to like, well, maybe he did, right? Like, I don't know, but I wouldn't call that a lunatic, but he certainly had a different worldview than a lot of people today would say, that they would affirm certain claims about things, but no, just different perspective. So does that mean that he is therefore the orthodox lord of Christian theology with all that that somehow seems to immediately come with? Well, no, then like it's a false trinary. That doesn't speak to the reality to any of this, right? There's like so many issues of the well-intentioned errors that go into the storytelling of the Gospels, the different worldview, the different aims of the texts, the lack of the historical genre, the dot 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 dot. It's a radical misframing of the entire issue. So again, to make clear, the point here, I hope is evident that we haven't presumed that miracles aren't possible. We haven't said, oh, we go into the text knowing that miracles can't happen and therefore everything miraculous has got to go. We haven't done any of that. We've just taken in a broader set of informational data to use as part of our interpretive reading of a text, which is what good historians should do to try to fill out the context, right? And what we should attempt to do in any situation where we're reading into the historical moment of a particular person. And I would even go so far as to say that we should presume maybe that something anomalous related to the historical phenomena that Jesus of Nazareth was a part of. I don't think that we need to be even reticent about saying something like that. I mean, he was known as a healer and an exorcist, so people thought he was doing some unusual things. And I think it's a fair and open issue that we could say that yeah, unusual things happen. Anomalous things happen. Today, anomalous things happen, right? People have near-death experiences or, they see things move, whatever. You know, Paul's Vanderklay's reading that book on people flying around, levitating. I don't know what to make of all that stuff. I mean, to be fair, a lot of that stuff is talking about stuff a long time ago, so the credibility of the historical evidence is. But whatever, we have these experiences that we that occur to us, and we see things happen, and we say, well, that there was something going on there, and it's a little bit outside of our kind of given naturalistic framework. And personally, I'm okay with that. I mean, we know that our naturalistic framework is not complete. I mean, literally, what the Nobel Prize in physics, I think, just went to these folks that kind of proved the whole spooky action at a distance stuff, and none of that makes sense in the kind of new Einsteinian vision of a relative the relativity theory and all that stuff, right? Like things can't move faster than the speed of light, et cetera. So like even in the existing contemporary scientific paradigm, there is contradiction and there are edge cases and there are we don't know. And we do know that we don't know. We do know that we'll learn more things that will hopefully bring some coherence to our current understanding of things. And personally, to make it very clear, I'm very fine with there being anomalous information that doesn't fit into our paradigm that we don't have to just say that doesn't happen. But to be clear, I don't think that then means we need to just be open to any old thing and just say, oh, okay, well, therefore there's no such thing as naturalism and there's no genuine insights of modernity and science and natural law. I don't think that's the right takeaway there. I'm inclined to view this more in light of what Bobby Azarian talks about as meta-naturalism, which is this idea that, to draw from that line, I forget who said it, that, a sufficiently advanced form of technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's something like that as our understanding of reality increases and we're able to learn more, a lot of what we thought of as magical gets folded into our naturalistic framing of reality. And in that sense, is no longer magical. It's naturalistic. I just talked to Layman Pascal about this, and we had some kind of agreement about this issue. And so we should be trying to fold in those aspects of our experience that are anomalous to our current scientific paradigm and naturalize them. And I believe that many of the things that we currently see as being quote unquote supernatural can indeed be naturalized. And I think that's a very beautiful and wonderful thing. Even Augustine, by the way, and this was pointed out. Oh, I wish I'd saved their handle, but someone commented on my video, and they gave me this Augustine quote, which I think is great. Augustine said, "quote A miracle is not contrary to nature, but only to our knowledge of nature." There it is. I'm totally fine with that. Now, given that, I'm fine to accept that probably maybe some things that we don't know about might have occurred in the course of the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and people were awed and astounded by it, and that spread his reputation as a magical man, you know? Sure, okay, fine. But given that, even we're still confronted by the issue that the miracles recounted in the Gospels probably didn't happen for all the other reasons I've already said. So, not only staying agnostic to the issue of miracles, but even being open to them as a possibility purely on the basis of historical reasoning and all the basis of evidentiary, contextual, interpretive sense making, there's every reason, I believe, to conclude that most of those things are later retroactive storytelling and fabrications and sort of tales to fit prophetic expectations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so ultimately, the story doesn't change much in that sense. Um, Now, the takeaway from all this is probably a lot that I've said might be really hard for more traditionally theologically minded folks to grapple with. This was very hard stuff for me to grapple with. Um, Very hard stuff. And so I want to appreciate that and honor that and respect it. And I'm also not out here trying to yuck people's yum or to do this sort of antagonistic new atheist thing. That's not at all what I'm after, because I actually want a thriving form of metamodern Christianity to be a valid, viable possibility in our world. I want that to be the case. I think that's a good thing. I think we need religion and we need spirituality and we need people to have meaning and to relate meaningfully with the traditions. We need to update our traditions, update our understanding of them, and allow them to continue to sustain people into the future. So I'm not trying to come down hard and destroy people's faiths or any of that. And especially as someone who experienced a faith crisis, a meaning crisis, I would never wish that for anyone, even though I also know that those things can be incredibly productive and generative for people as hard as they are. But still, that's not something you force on people. So why am I getting at all of this? Well, there's been conversation about meta-modern Christianity. And I think metamodern entails an integration and a synthesis of the pre-modern, modern, postmodern into something generatively new and productive and novel. And so, if we're going to have something like a metamodern Christianity, then it needs to grapple with the modern. I see people bringing in the pre-modern, that's there. I see people bringing in the postmodern and the relativism and the I should say contextualization and the recognition that people come from perspectives and all that. That's there. Great. What I don't see is people grappling with the modern. So that's just all I'm trying to do with all of this, is to try to bring that in, try to make it clear to people why we have to grapple with these things. These things aren't going away. You can't just like sidestep this and say, oh, but we have postmodern perspectivalism now, and so we're granted immunity from modernity. No, it doesn't work that way. You got to grapple with these things, and you have to make sense of them. And I just want to see more of that, I guess. I see an anxiety about this kind of material and an effort in every way to move beyond it, to bypass it, um, to try to use the postmodern and say, oh, well, look, now we don't have to care much about that modern stuff, and we can just kind of affirm these pre-modern beliefs in the scriptures. And that's not going to cut it. And I guess it's just as simple as that. So the takeaway, I think, is that we need to take this seriously, uh, and we have to grapple with the separation that exists between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. And I think that a meta-modern Christianity can take very seriously the Christ of faith and the historical Jesus and the gulf that exists between them and hold that kind of contradiction as a compelling developmental paradox. And there are multiple ways of making sense of that. And I'm sure I'll continue to explore this issue and make videos about it to see what that really looks like, what it can mean, and how different people do that. But I think that if we don't acknowledge the modern aspect of this, then we lose the history. And that has very deleterious impacts on the way that people relate to each other, the world, and for the sustainable future of the religion ultimately. So, how do we update Christianity? We need to take in the modern lens. We have to take it seriously. We have to acknowledge the gulf that exists, and we have to, I would say, appreciate that the truth of Christianity lies in the 2,000 years of Christian psychocultural evolution, not just in the 3 or so years of Jesus's ministry. Um, the historical fact that a person named Jesus of Nazareth lived is important, and it is a seminal moment in the tradition. But we don't have to hang our hat on the peg of the history. We can appreciate that the unfolding evolution of that germ that gets started in that historical moment brings with it the flower of more of the truth of the Christian tradition, and that we should try to unfold that into our understanding of reality. But those 2,000 years mean taking in the last 500 of the modern epoch and the historical critical lens and revealing to us how the Christian message has actually evolved and shifted, and how people's understanding of Jesus has evolved and shifted, and seeing the truth that exists in that. That's what I would be inclined to suggest as the proper attitude to these divergent accounts, uh, so that we can see that Christianity is actually more true today, that it's even more Christian today, because it's more real, because it accounts for more of reality, and that those who want to valorize the Christian tradition are right to do so, but they should appreciate that tradition in light of its whole totality, which includes the modern and postmodern moments as part of its evolution. And the only way that we're going to get to a meta-modern Christianity is by moving through those. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully that clarifies my perspective a little bit. Hopefully it shows a bit where I'm coming at this issue from, how I'm not just trying to smuggle in a modern anti-miracle metaphysics and then presuming that which I would hope to prove, and that if we're going to take history seriously, as we do in all other areas of our lives, we should take it seriously about the Christian message and the Christian materials and grapple meaningfully with the challenges that doing so poses. Because I believe it'll be the essential wrestling with God that needs to occur as we move into the future and remain active participants in the progressive unfolding and revelation of the divine in the world. All right. Hopefully that was interesting, compelling. Excoriate me in your comments. Tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me again to read C.S. Lewis's Miracles, because I will do that. And any other things that you think should be addressed that I didn't get to. Godspeed, everyone.